The Prime Minister's speech about Brexit in Florence on Friday had been billed as a breakthrough moment for the negotiations. She was expected to take a softer tone than in the past, perhaps promised to continue paying in to ensure that little changed in the first 3 years. But then the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson set out his views publicly that the UK should not pay anything and we should get out of the single market and customs union as soon as possible. So will she harden her speech to satisfy him? And if not, will he go? The veteran former Cabinet Minister, well-known Remainer Ken Clarke, is in Nottingham. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What do you think the Prime Minister should do now?
I think she should set out a programme in Florence, which is for the first time really agreed across the Cabinet, if possible. I very much hope it is the government's policy, which is realistic, which sets out what we can reasonably expect to achieve in negotiations, tries to maintain free access to the European market, no new barriers for our trade, no new barriers to investment, to make sure that we minimise, or if we possibly can, avoid economic damage to this country.
Okay.
Now, alongside that, personal publicity and campaigning by the Foreign Secretary is actually just an irrelevant nuisance, and I think people have already said quite enough about somebody who's the Foreign Secretary just joining in a few days before and repeating one of the more simplistic and dishonest arguments of the hardline leavers during the referendum campaign. They use the money because it appeals to the public who don't, I think, follow very closely the details of what Parliament and the negotiations are engaged in. Modern trading deals are extremely complicated. You tell people we're giving money to foreigners, and quite a lot of the public say they're against it. It's quite difficult to defend the development budget. You can defend paying money to Europe. We always have. British governments have. The Germans pay, the Dutch pay, the Norwegians pay. The developed countries, if they have free access to the market, have to, amongst other things, to contribute to the continued regional aid, the development of the economies of Eastern and Central Europe. They have to pay for a lot of other things.
You're very critical there of what the Foreign Secretary has done. What should the Prime Minister do about him then?
Well, you want me to talk in personalities about the Foreign Secretary. I will a bit. They should tell him that if he wants to be Foreign Secretary, he should actually make some more serious contributions on wider foreign policy, give his views on the Brexit deal privately, as ministers have always been supposed to do. Remember that there are rules called collective responsibility. Sounding off personally in this way is totally unhelpful, and he shouldn't exploit the fact that she hasn't got a majority in Parliament, and he knows perfectly well that although normally a Foreign Secretary would be sacked instantly for doing that, and she unfortunately, after the general election, is not in a position easily to sack him, but he should stop exploiting it.
You mean he should be sacked now, but she's not strong enough to do it?
Well, in any normal circumstances, he'd have been sacked the day after.
But there is an argument. Look, he's the Foreign Secretary. Why can't he talk about the biggest single foreign policy issue? And also, he's one of the few people who's giving an upbeat message about a future post-Brexit.
All this, if you jump off the cliff and spread out your arms, you'll find you're flying up to the broad blue yonder. Yes, that's not a policy. When you're Foreign Secretary, you're a leading member of a government. The foreign policy you propound is the policy of the government which you've agreed with your colleagues. It's the only sensible, grown-up way to run a government.
But don't you go to the heart of it there, which is that from what we are hearing, nothing has been agreed at Cabinet. It is split, which is why William Hague writes today that really the Cabinet, the government's got to get its act together and come up with a united position. Otherwise, as he says, we won't be talking about who's the Foreign Secretary or who is whichever role. It'll be Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister and John McDonnell and Diane Abbott in the Cabinet.
I just agree with that. Yeah, that's obvious common sense. I mean, that is, and actually that is how we're perceived by our continental neighbours at the moment. Things are rather stalled because we have lots of friends, not only inside the European Union, across the world, who cannot understand what we think we're doing. Now, if there are genuine disagreements within the Cabinet, and I agree, I get the impression there are, and it's not surprising because both the political parties are completely split, and the full range of views is represented in the Cabinet and the shadow Cabinet, incidentally, as well. They're not agreed with each other. But in the national interest, there really got to be some compromise to come together. You do that in Cabinet discussions.
Indeed, but
you do that by talking to the Prime Minister privately. You don't put self-publicising articles in the most Eurosceptic newspaper you can think of that's read by most of the people who've got a vote in a leadership election. That's enough of Boris. What we hope is going to emerge is firstly, an agreed policy. But second,
I want to talk about the policy
public.
Because you put forward what effectively sounds like a Swiss-style deal where we pay in, perhaps, I think the House of Commons has worked out 40% of what we'd do now if it was the same model. We have EU laws and regulations, freedom of movement. We're not part of the customs union. But why do you think people are going to unite around that? There are plenty of people in the government who'd say, no, that's not Brexit.
Because it isn't just the business lobbies, it's most economists, all but a few mavericks, everybody actually who looks at the state of the world today, who says that is the basis that a developed country like ours, which is very dependent on its trading position, actually best succeeds, and will be very badly damaged if we start putting new barriers in the way of, firstly, a lot of our exports, not just our motor cars, but our major export market for food and agricultural products to the European Union. It is senseless to put new barriers in when you don't have them at the moment. They may have to be modified because it looks as though we are leaving. I accept we're leaving, but let's have a serious negotiation, and actually we will find that a lot of our friends on the continent also wish to minimise the disruption. It'll need a long transitional period to sort out the details. The idea it'll all be done overnight is nonsense. During that transition period, then you keep, so far as you can, the present arrangements. I think we should stay in the customs union. I think we should stay in the single market and accept some of the obligations of that, because we'll get enormous benefits. It's already made us poorer.
We must leave it there. Thank you very much.
Time for the weather forecast, Tom.
And